Let's begin.
Scary Story fanatics, welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Are you ready for a story that's out of this world? Summertime at the lake has never happened. It's such an unexpected place. So if you're ready, settle in for an exciting story that Doughboy420 likes to call Beyond Locust Lake, The Mother's Curse.
When the first collection team found Erikson, it had been a short while before he and the remnants of the ship he was upon were picked up by the recovery crew. But after he awoke to find that the nightmare was not over, and that all of his would-be rescuers had been massacred, just like the ship where he once lived. Then, after that, he spent weeks aboard the ship as the corpses filling it began to rot. All he could do to survive was eat what he could in short intervals between shifts of short naps and hiding stuffed into circuitry and ventilation ducts, hiding from the nightmarish things that roamed the otherwise vacant rooms and corridors of the tomb in the darkness of space. Then, he heard voices approaching him, voices that were not that of the fiendish woman that walked the halls with her horrific brethren. Taunting. Always taunting. At first, Erikson feared that it was just a hallucination brought on by the maddening cabin fever of space and the endless torment and lack of sleep brought on by the monsters that hunted him day in and day out. But after the people had passed by, and he could see that they were wearing the Daedalus security insignia on their sleeves, Erikson finally mustered up the courage to approach them. Help! Please help! Erikson managed to mumble as he fell out of the ventilation duct beside them, almost collapsing upon the floor with exhaustion. He'd barely consumed any food or water over the past few weeks, and on top of that, he was nearly out of his mind with insomnia. "Hey, we got a live one!" yelled a man close by, before Erikson fell into unconsciousness. When he awoke, he was hooked up to hydration tubes that ran intravenously into his arm. He looked around in confusion and almost ripped the IV needle out before the doctor stopped him.
Hey, it's okay. You're safe now.
She attempted to calm him. "Where am I?" Erikson asked in a panic.
You're aboard the Daedalus research and recovery vessel, the Apex.
The woman replied. "What happened to the other ship? The one I was on? Where is it?" Erikson demanded answers.
The ship is docked with ours, and our crew are processing and preparing everyone for cremation. I'm sorry.
The woman answered with empathy. "No!" Erikson yelled. "They have to get off the ship! Tell them to get out of there!" Erikson commanded her. Just then, a group of men came in, one of them limping with a huge gash in his leg, a wound so large that, even though it was tied off with a tourniquet, he was still gushing everywhere and losing blood quickly. "Doc, patch him up!" a familiar man yelled. It was the same guy that had found him earlier.
What happened?
The doctor asked. "I fell on this goddamn rusty blade at the end of a pole, sliced right through me like a torch blade," the injured man said, wincing in pain. "If it was a torch blade that hit your leg would be gone, and you'd be hopping around with a sizzling stump, Roddy," a third, bigger guy said as he helped the injured man onto the examination table. The doctor quickly went to work, applying a numbing agent to the wound before adding chemicals that caused the gash to swell and burn as the infection and foreign particles were drawn out, where they could be cleanly wiped away before the wound was sealed up with a medical-grade super-hardening glue, acting both as a means of healing the wound and protecting it from damage by becoming hard as bone for a period of time, while the wound was able to fully heal.
Keep off it for a week or two, and then you should be right as rain,
the doctor said, using an old Earth expression that didn't make much sense in that day and age, considering many of them had spent most, if not all their lives in the metallic halls of ships and space stations. There were very few suitable planets to settle on, and none of them resembled their home world that their forefathers had depleted so long ago. They were all of near extreme conditions, just on the edge of what human beings were able to survive on, and even fewer still would have anything resembling thriving on the surface of any of these worlds. A large portion of humanity had taken to living aboard massive ships and even bigger satellite stations revolving around specific strategic planets. "Where's the cargo from the ship I was on? Where did you take that thing that cut your leg?" Erikson demanded. "Chill, man. It's all aboard your ship off the cargo bay. Your team's gonna catalog everything, send the data back to Daedalus. We know what we're doing," answered the man laying on the medical table. "Sure looks like it," Erikson mumbled to himself. "What was that?" the wounded man asked with a bit of a grumble. "You have to get rid of that cargo. Open the bay doors and flush it out into space. Detach the ship and let it go," Erikson commanded. "You can't do that. Our bosses would kill us. This is a valuable cargo to them. We're making bank on this one. Are you out of your mind?" replied the bigger of the three men. "Maybe I am," Erikson said, before jumping up and ripping the IV needle out of his arm, where he then raced out the medbay door, away from a confused bunch that quickly realized what Erikson had in mind. Erikson ran down the hallway, dodging past people going about their day. He bumped into some of them as he passed, but continued on. He was on a mission to save all of them. He turned the corner and entered the elevator to travel down to the cargo bay, knowing at least the basic layout of the ship because every ship in the Daedalus fleet had a similar layout, with very few differences across the classes of ship. The vessel that he had previously been on was a repurposed Daedalus Generation 1 ship, so although this one was a Generation 3 and was a bit bigger than its former prison in space, the layout was still very similar. However, unfortunately for Erikson, the computer's feminine voice made him aware of a setback when it announced,
"Now arriving at engineering. Elevator lock engaged. Access to base levels not available at this time. Please seek a maintenance advisor.
And the doors dinged open. Erikson got off the elevator at the engineering level, where the maintenance department, mechanical, and engine controls were located. He proceeded down the corridor and turned the corner to make his way toward the elevator release, when he found a scene of complete horror. Bodies in yellow jumpsuits laid scattered all about, some of them dismembered, some of them sliced clean through, decapitated men and women, crushed body parts. It was the nightmarish scene that Erikson had feared the most. The beasts were already free upon the ship. Erikson looked around for the elevator release controls, but when he found them in the adjoining room, he discovered that they'd been destroyed by a man laying dead over top of them, stabbed completely through by some large cylindrical object. The only way to release the cargo now was to manually override the system from the bridge, where the central computer was located, or take the express elevator from the bridge down to the cargo bay. When Erikson turned to run toward the midship elevator that led to the bridge, he heard a scream. He then looked ahead to find a tall man, dressed all in black, a carved wooden mask clinging to his melted flesh. He could just barely be seen in the darkness ahead, the flickering of malfunctioning lights illuminating his form as he held onto a screaming and struggling woman with one hand before the other drove a broken pole saw blade through the woman's torso. She writhed in agony upon being impaled by the rusty blade on a wooden pole before she finally went limp. The tall monster of a man then withdrew his weapon and dropped the lifeless corpse, where she crumpled into a heap on the floor. Erikson reacted quickly and ducked around the corner to the elevator, where he frantically began pressing the button as the murderous man approached him. Finally, the doors opened and he was able to slip inside as the man in the wooden mask slashed his pole saw against the metal of the elevator doors, closing behind him. When the doors opened again, he was happy to find security there. They would definitely be able to stop those things and dump the source of their strange infection into space, where it would never be anyone's problem ever again. Security immediately detained Erikson for leaving the medical bay before the quarantine and observation time had elapsed. "Wait, stop! What are you doing?" Erikson yelled.
"You need to go back to quarantine in the med bay. Who knows what you might be carrying? You could be infected with something for all we know."
One of the masked security enforcers told him after grabbing a hold of his arms and wrenching it behind his back to be placed into restraints. "It's not me that's infected! It's the ship! It's the ship!" Erikson yelled. But his revelations fell upon deaf ears as he was escorted back into the elevator to be brought back down to the medical bay. But as they were making the descent, an alarm sounded requesting their immediate response.
Warning. Emergency personnel requested in the medical bay immediately. Warning. Emergency personnel requested in the medical bay immediately.
The monotone, automated female voice of the ship's computer sounded off an emergency request. "Well, lucky for us, that's just where we're headed." A younger security agent spoke as he stepped in front of the door, blocking Erikson's view of what was to come. "Stop! We need to go! We need to eject the ship from the docking bay or we're all gonna die!" Erikson begged. But all of them simply shrugged it off as the paranoid ramblings of cabin fever, brought on by the empty blackness of endless space.
"If we don't salvage cargo, we don't get paid."
A woman in the back of the group spoke up. "You don't understand. We need to get far away from there. Please!" Erikson begged, but it was too late.
"Chill, whatever it is, we can handle it."
The woman in the back spoke once more. The elevator door opened. What the fuck? Was all the guy in front was able to get out before a large bone saw ripped through his torso, its bloody tip coming within inches of Erikson's face before being withdrawn from the soldier's back and out through the open hole, completely through him.
"Shit! Open fire!"
The commander of the group ordered before the men carrying Erikson dropped him and readied their weapons. Erikson pressed his hands over his ears as an eruption of gunfire sounded off, pumping the hooded beast of a man with enough ammunition to bring down a small vessel, much less a man. The bullets tore through the behemoth in the patchwork mask, ripping chunks off his body and riddling him full of holes of all sizes, leaving what was left of him as a smoking pile of bloody flesh upon the floor.
I told you we could handle it.
The woman spoke again as she exited the elevator, only to have the large, daedalus military knife driven through her skull with such force that the blade pierced the metal interior of the medbay entrance. The remaining security agents reloaded their weapons and opened fire once more, now unleashing a hail of bullets at the tall man in the wooden mask that stood nearby, and as their attention was drawn to Jacob Treagle, they did not see the mess that was Casper Stoical's bloody corpse reforming and piecing itself back together, as if time was rewinding for him, his flesh fusing back together and reshaping him into the beast he was once more. Casper approached the commander of the group from his side, catching him completely off guard, where the man in the patchwork mask clapped his hands together on either side of the captain's head and squeezed. He screamed in pain and fright and delivered several gunshots to Casper's torso, with no effect. Casper simply pushed his hands together until the man's head simply popped like a nasty zit. The remainder of the group panicked. Some of them fled, and some of them turned to open fire on Casper, while others remained locked onto Jacob, but none of them saw the third demon of the lake, the Mad Doctor, Dr. Clark, as she approached through a nearby corridor.
I'm afraid it's time to operate.
The Mad Doctor spoke as she drove a scalpel into the skull of one man, while a pair of forceps were driven through the eye socket of another. Erikson quickly slipped back into the elevator and pressed the button. He knew the rest of them were dead, and he left them to be finished off by the monsters of Locust Lake. The doors closed behind him, and the elevator raised toward the bridge. The doors opened, and Erikson stepped out into the corridor that led to the bridge. Quickly, he made his way down the hall, where he barged into the control room and began barking orders. "You need to dump the ship that you just got, right now," Erikson demanded. "We have to, or we're all gonna die," he added, shouting at the captain and crew.
"Who are you and what are you doing on my bridge?"
The captain asked the intruder. "We need to dump it now," Erikson yelled, attempting to charge the controls and do it himself.
Hey, stop!
The girl at the control console fought him, trying to prevent him from gaining access to the cargo bay controls.
"Someone call security and get this psycho out of here,"
the captain commanded. "Hey, Samantha just found this weird doll in her room. Do any of you know where it came from? Is this some kind of sick joke?" A man interrupted as he entered, holding what looked like a burned, old wooden doll. And no one would have paid him any mind had this question not been followed by a blood-curdling yell as the wooden figure that he held delivered several slices and stabs with a tiny pocket knife, cutting him in quick succession. Everyone's attention was quickly drawn to the chaos as the small wooden marionette dropped to the floor and ran for the exit, leaving them all stunned and speechless.
"Somebody want to tell me what the hell that was?"
the captain yelled out, absolutely perplexed by what he had just witnessed. It appeared to be a doll, sir," one of the men spoke up.
"I know what it looked like, Jeffries. Don't be an idiot."
The captain scolded his subordinate. Before anyone could assess the situation any further, Erikson attempted to once again jettison the cargo of his former ship off into space, but it was stopped by a sudden onslaught of chaos as the demons of Locust Lake poured into the control room. The small, burned marionette returned with his larger friends in tow. A woman in old Earth office attire, her jaw broken and hanging half off of her face. A giant of a man, tall and lanky, his flesh fused to a wooden mask that clung to his face, the rest of him covered with ripped and torn black clothing, including a long, matching trench coat. Finally, there came a hulking, beastly figure in a dirty, tan-colored coat that was all ragged and torn with age. He wore black clothing filled with rips and holes beneath it, and an old, black hood that had a jagged mouth sewn into it, along with an X stitched over one eye. This beast of a man grabbed a hold of the first person he could, where he then smashed the body like a rag doll into the nearest control console, sending sparks flying and thousands of volts through their twitching body. Jacob, the tall, monstrous man, gripped his burned hand around the throat of the communications officer, digging his fingers into his neck with such force that he began to bleed around the decayed nails of Jacob's fingers. The man struggled and begged with silent pleas before Jacob threw him to the ground and delivered a massive boot to his face, breaking his jaw and nose before the boot was raised once more and driven downward again, snapping the man's neck and crushing his face inward. The mad doctor cackled as she sliced through the woman at the warp drive controls, slashing and cutting her with scalpel in each hand, slicing the woman's skin as she attempted to fight the ghostly being off. But she was no match for the unnatural strength of Dr. Clark. The small, burned marionette took out the captain's right kneecap, stabbing a little pocket knife behind it and popping it right off his knee, causing him to scream in pain as he dropped to the floor, down to the level of Mr. Shaw, the maniacal marionette, where he was able to slice the captain's throat with ease. Erikson took advantage of the chaos to operate the console and release the lock to the ship that they found him on and eject it into space. But when he did, he got an error. There was a jam preventing him from releasing it from the bridge. He had to clear the jam and release it manually from inside the cargo bay. "Shit," Erikson whispered to himself before slowly making his way to the exit, while Casper ripped a long, tubular, fluorescent light bulb from the ceiling overhead. Next, he grabbed a hold of another screaming officer and pushed the bulb into his screaming mouth and down his now gagging throat, where he then released his grasp on the man and punched him in the neck, shattering the light bulb inside and sending shards of glass slicing through his esophagus. As Erikson made his way quietly out the escape door, the devilish Mr. Shaw leapt onto the woman at the console where he had previously been, stabbing her repeatedly in the face, popping her eyes, and slicing through her cheeks with his tiny pocket knife. Erikson rushed down the corridor to the express elevator as the screaming fell silent behind him. He had to hurry. They were assuredly right behind him. He pressed the button to go down, and the doors quickly closed. He was on his way to the cargo bay. Soon he would be home free. He just had to clear the jam and detach that damn ship from the cargo bay. Let it go. Let it drift into space, far, far away from anyone whom its contents could ever harm again. The door opened to the lower cargo bay where the ship was docked, and Erikson was immediately hit with a sight of horror. Everyone was dead. The entire cargo and maintenance crew were slaughtered, cut up and torn to pieces, their bodies scattered about the bay, laid out, broken over Daedalus marked boxes, hung up on hovering cargo hooks that were used to more easily guide heavy cargo. There were even people crushed beneath such heavy cargo. Then Erikson spotted it. The blockage in the gears that prevented his ship from disengaging. A man's mangled body had been crushed and ground up inside the massive gears that locked the ship in place. Quickly, Erikson got to work. He grabbed hold of an arm and a leg and yanked backwards. With a few good pulls, the body broke free, at least part of it. Much of him had been twisted and crushed up inside the gears. Disgusted, Erikson quickly removed each chunk of the man's twisted body that was left inside, trying to clear as much of him as he could with his bare hands in a desperate attempt to free up the gears. "I hope this works," Erikson said, wiping the chunky bits and blood off of his hands. But as he turned to head up the walkway to the cargo release, he stopped when he heard a strange clinking noise, kind of like a cracking and crunching of bones. The strange sound echoed throughout the cavernous cargo bay, making Erikson unsure of its source. He looked around but didn't see anything, so he quickly made his way up to the walkway ramp toward the console. But before he could make it there, he was knocked off of his feet by a massive hand that swung down from above him. Erikson looked up from the cold metal floor to find a thin, gaunt-looking beast with long, spindly arms. Its eyes were sunken in, only blackness of hollow sockets in their place, the skin sucked inwards, clinging tightly to the bones, revealing the shape of the skull beneath. The thing crawled down the wall, moving unnaturally as if it were a spider, its arms and legs twisting to conform to the surface that it clung to. The thing screeched as its hand moved towards Erikson, and he believed that he was done for until a hail of bullets tore through the monster, causing it to shriek in pain before it ran off as quickly as it could into the darkness, climbing and swinging its way into the shadows of the rafters far away, where it slipped into a vent and disappeared.
Are you alright?
A familiar woman's voice spoke.
What the hell are these things?
The woman questioned further as she came into view. It was the doctor that had treated him, and she was with a squad of security officers, some of which were the very guys that Erikson had met previously in the medical bay, all of them armed to the teeth with every bit of firepower that they could get their hands on. They were decked out with bandoliers, and some of them carried melee weapons. Daedalus-grade military knives and machetes. One guy even had himself a torch blade that he had picked up from engineering. "We have to release the ship and get as far away from it as we can. We brought something up from Earth that we shouldn't have, and now we have to get rid of it, or those things will just keep coming," Erikson explained.
Shit.
The woman began.
I think it might be too late for that.
She added. "We're already home," a man said from behind her. "What?" Erikson yelled out in dismay.
Now initiating docking sequence with Mother Station Merope.
The feminine, computerized voice spoke once more. No, please," Erikson begged, but there was nothing that could be done. Erikson turned and looked out the large energy wall bay door at the side of the ship, and there, beyond the damned ship, was the large mother base of the Daedalus fleet. The Merope, a colossal, circular space station that rotated around a central column, and beyond it was Kalos, a bright, amber-colored gas giant. As the group of them were distracted by the awe of the massive planet beyond the bay doors, they were not aware of the bleeding, red eyes that watched them, glaring with a centuries-old rage that could never be satiated. Water dropped from the coolant pipes that ran through the ship, and here it pooled into buckets and puddles, and it was here that the source of the curse made herself known. A Kenefti Oniga rose up from the watery darkness, controlling the water inside. She ruptured the pipes, flooding a torrent of freezing cold rain down onto the security officers and Erikson, but it did not remain cold for long. Soon it grew to boiling as it burned with the grieving mother's undying rage. The liquid scaled the skin of those it fell upon, and it soaked them from head to toe as they quickly climbed to higher ground as the water began to flood across the lower areas of the cargo bay, bubbling and gurgling. Then the rest of them came like a torrent of their own. The monsters of Locust Lake rushed onto the upper walkways where the group had fled to. They opened fire on the beasts, but their bullets were no match for an immortal corpse. Dr. Clark pounced upon a screaming officer, knocking him to the floor.
Your voice sounds harsh. think I have to perform a pharyngectomy.
The Mad Doctor joked before slicing the man's neck and pulling out the stringy bits of flesh inside. The next officer was decapitated when Jacob Treagle ripped a metal container lid off its hinges and swung it with enough speed to pop the man's head right off of his body, where it was embedded into the inner hull of the ship at the edge of the walkway. Casper picked up one officer and slammed his head down onto the railing at the side, snapping his neck, leaving the woman behind him to begin firing upon the behemoth with everything she could. But it was no use. The man in the stitchwork mask simply tossed her aside, throwing her completely through the safety energy wall and out into the vacuum of space, where her screams were ended by ice crystals filling her airways and down into her core almost instantaneously. The starving monster returned and swiped the man right up off of his feet, where he took a large chunk out of his shoulder before the thing's jaw unhinged like a snake and it began to swallow the entire, still screaming head of the man before biting it clean off and swallowing it whole, the head stretching out a bulbous neck of the starving beast before disappearing into its core as if it were never there at all. The doll, like Mr. Shaw, stayed low and sliced through a man's Achilles tendon, causing him to scream out in pain and drop to the floor, where the marionette was able to shove an arm down his throat, slicing away at the flesh from the inside with his tiny knife, flooding the man's airways with blood, before he finally stopped fighting. Jacob ripped a military machete from the hand of one man and used it to slice clean through both he and the woman behind him, cutting through his torso and slicing the woman's head off at nose level. The man with the torch blade charged towards the beast of the lake, where he drove the blade of the heated plasma through Casper's torso. It sliced him like butter, causing the rotting flesh to sizzle and smoke, filling the air with a putrid aroma. Torch blades were used to cut industrial metals, so it carved and cooked flesh like it was nothing. Casper looked the screaming man in the eye, completely unfazed by the attack. He pushed the officer away from him, where he fell onto his back several feet away, nearly rolling off the walkway in the process. From there, Casper gripped the handle of the superheated blade of the plasma and withdrew it from his body, his decaying flesh sizzling all the while, where he then turned the blade on the one that delivered it to him. The butcher of Locust Lake lived up to his name by slicing off choice cuts of meat. He effortlessly hacked off both the man's arms in an instant. Then, with one swipe, the legs of his new work of art were removed as well, leaving him with just a torso. He screamed in pain, then began to convulse with the sudden excruciating shock of losing his limbs, where Casper then sliced him clean down the middle, his eyelids falling limp and pupils rolling downward on either side as he was split in half, severing their connection with the brain. "Let's go!" Erikson grabbed the girl's hand and rushed her through the docking bay and into his ship, where they sealed the doors behind them.
Where are we going?
The woman demanded to know. "We're docking with Merope now. Maybe with enough firepower, we can get out of this. And if the Daedalus can't do it, we're all screwed anyway," Erikson explained, as he led her into the room toward the back of the ship. Here he detached a ventilation cover from the wall and motioned for the woman to climb inside. She wasn't so sure about climbing into the ventilation shaft with a total stranger, but she figured that the alternative of a horribly gruesome death was probably not a better route. So the girl climbed inside and Erikson went in afterward, closing the lid behind him. He was right back where he started. Right back to square one. Hopefully next time he would succeed in escaping from this endless nightmare.
Well, I suppose if you end up in space hunted by the creatures of Locust Lake, you probably should just blow yourself out the airlock and call it a day. But if you're not ready to call your love of horror a day, make sure to stop by again next weekend for me to deliver to you that gore galore. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.
social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.